It's the internet. You're busy. Let's do this. I'm Jeff Grubb. I work for Giant Bomb. I want to talk to you about why we're not going to get a third God of War in this series. Now, that's not news. Everyone knows that. They've confirmed that. They've said Ragnarok is going to be the end of this two-part series. That is strange, though, if you've been around gaming for a long time. You know, if one thing is a consistent truth throughout the history of video games, it is that publishers love sequels. They love continuing things and driving them into the ground as much as possible to get as much value out of them as possible. But it seems like, at least at Sony Interactive Entertainment, that's changed. And it seems like it's coming from a place of wisdom, if I'm to be so bold. Wisdom and maturity, though, that's very different than what happened last time. We got 2005's God of War, and then 2 years later, God of War 2. A couple years later, we got God of War Chains of Olympus. A couple years after that, God of War 3, and then Ghost of Sparta that same year, and then God of War Ascension in 2013. So a lot of God of Wars. Obviously, game development wasn't as lengthy or as expensive back then, so you could put out more games more frequently. But really what happened here is this game just followed a natural cycle that happens pretty often in gaming. God of War 1 came out, was a big success. Its direct sequel came out, was also a very large success, and both of those games critically acclaimed. Now, they all sold very well, and that includes God of War 3, which sold just about as well as the first two. But that's when things start to change a little bit. That's when critical reception starts to cool. And what is the main complaint? This is a bit too familiar. It's a lot of the same stuff, and as impressive as it is, and as great as the game looked on PS3 and then on the PS4, and that's a big part, one of the reasons it sold so well is it was available on both eventually. But as good as it was very reminiscent of what we got before. And then where'd the series go from there? Well, that leads to God of War Ascension, a game that is mostly forgotten at this point. A game a lot of players don't even really consider when they're thinking back about the God of War franchise. And this is not to say that Ascension killed God of War until the reboot or anything like that. What I'm really saying here is that this was a problem that Sony has identified. That you can have a game do really well, then its sequel is going to come out and it's going to carry forward all that hype. And all that hype is going to pay off in sales and critical reception. And basically it's like taking a celebration lap in a race. The second game comes out, it kind of can do no wrong as long as it at least meets what the previous game was. Then if the third game comes out and does that again, that's when diminishing returns begin to hit pretty hard. Now, not nearly enough to do real damage to the sales or even critical, assessment of that game. There's a lot of people who are going to tell you God of War 3 is their favorite God of War. I might be among them. But the point is that you begin to see the cracks in the foundation to the point where if you are working on these games, you have to change things up the next time around. And that could lead you to sort of wildly grasping at what your next idea might be, and you might end up with a God of War Ascension instead. Now, I don't want to call Ascension a bad game. I've never played it, and that's beside the point. The issue really is that Ascension was an issue for Sony when it released it, in that the critical reception was very cool, and that the sales were seeing a decline. Now, the bigger issue today is you definitely could not release an Ascension now if you're Sony. The big problem is that games have gotten so much more expensive and they are such bigger bets that you don't ever want to find yourself on a road to Ascension. You need to avoid that wherever possible. And how can you do that? Well, I think Sony's figured it out with this 2-game method. A 1-2 punch and then get out. This is not a new idea, but it might be pretty new in video games. What this really makes me think of is Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson, a comedian, a talk show host. You might remember him. You might not if you're watching this video on YouTube, honestly. Anyway, he was a comedian. He was sort of a comedian's comedian. He had a good eye for talent, and he had a rule that he would basically lay down for his writing staff and for himself, mostly. And that rule was a 2-joke maximum for any one subject. If he got a big laugh on something, he would essentially repeat that joke or reframe it or rework it slightly to get a big laugh again. And that second one would always get an even bigger laugh. But then the third time you would try that same joke, you would see significant diminishing returns. There would still be laughter, but not nearly as many as there were for that second one, maybe not even as much as there was the first time around. And then if you did it a dreaded fourth time, well, then you have a God of War Ascension of jokes, and you've overstayed your welcome, and you need to get out of there. So Johnny Carson had a rule to just do 2. Never go down that route where you're at the third one or the fourth one. Just avoid it entirely. This is a difficult thing because when you're getting that reaction, you want to keep going toward that reaction. That's a natural human thing to want. But it's also natural for humans as an audience to begin pushing away at something that is overly familiar, something that we recognize and we could see how the joke works, and now it's no longer as effective as it once was. So that rule really works for comedy. I think that rule is also working for video games. And you can see how maybe God of War Ragnarok is a really good example of this 2-thing rule. You know, the 2 jokes, you get 1 laugh, you get a bigger laugh the second time around. Well, that's probably going to work with Ragnarok, even if things don't change up all that much. People don't want it to change all that much. They want the second joke. They want to be like, hey, I understood it the first time. It really connected with me. I want to connect with it again. It's the third time when things become a problem. So Ragnarok is in there's no risk of alienating people by being more of the same, even if it does have also a lot of new stuff according to reviews. Now, the big thing here is that this game is also getting the benefits of knowing ahead of time that there was going to be a 2-game rule. They decided a long time ago, hey, we are not going to do 3, 4, 5 games in this Norse arc. We're going to end everything here. So we could throw everything into this second game. The first game set everything up. Now we have this awesome playground to play around in, and we know we don't have to hold anything back for some third, fourth, or fifth game. Everything can happen here. And again, according to every review I've read, this is a massive game, maybe due to exactly that reasoning. Of course, I don't know what the next God of War is going to be like. Maybe it'll be a lot more similar than what I'm expecting. If that's the case, I don't think it'll be because they didn't have this rule. It'll be because they ignored it. If that makes sense. Still, though, I think it's a very restrained and mature way of looking at the way they need to be making games these days. Sony it's a hit factory. They make a lot of big games that people love. But this shows a sign that they understand what they're doing. They're very mindful of their history and the risks, and still be willing to put a lot of money on the line, but in a smart way. If they were to do this again and just make a God of War Norse 3, and it had the same big budget, that would be taking a chance, because you just don't know when people are going to get tired of something. Now, of course, this does create a lot of stress and a lot of strain on the producers for these games, because, okay, 2 games that took about 10 years to make, and now we got to basically think outside the box yet again. How do we do that? We just did that for God of War 2018. Now, that's going to be quite some time when it's all said and done. When we actually get to the next one, it'll be 15 years ago, or 10 years since that release, but 15 years since they started that process and came up with this is what God of War is going to be going forward. But honestly, like, what do you do next? How could you change things up? That is a problem for the future. They can prototype and come up with a bunch of ideas. But the point is that at least I think they're thinking in that direction in a way that developers usually haven't in the past, or at least they haven't been given the opportunity to. Maybe what's actually happening here is there is buy-in from the top about, hey, we see the problem too. Maybe developers have always known that third time is not the charm. The third time is when things begin to show their cracks, and then the fourth time is when things go really rotten. Developers have probably always understood this to some extent. It is publishers just looking at spreadsheets who are now being brought around, be like, hey, we've been in gaming our entire lives too. We see this pattern as well. We should cut it off before it becomes a major issue. And that's where they're at with God of War. So Kratos is following Johnny Carson's 2-joke rule, and it seems like it's going to really help keep things fresh, and so that they can avoid God of War Ascensions. Thank you for watching. Again, I'm Jeff Grubb. You can get more from me on Game Mess Decides every Thursday night. I do a podcast with my friend Mike Minotti. We also do Last of the Nintendogs on Tuesday nights. Both of those are live on YouTube. You can watch them right here on this YouTube channel. I also work for Giant Bomb. You can catch my stuff on giantbomb.com whenever you want. Thanks for watching. Goodbye, everybody. Until next time, have a good one. Take care of yourself.